When you think of words to describe the genre of metal music, it'll most likely be words like loud, abrasive, harsh, rough, dark. Words that, much like the name of the genre, evoke a harder, rougher tone and quality to it. If you ask any metal enthusiast, however, these words aren't necessarily a bad thing. If anything, it's what makes metal music awesome in its own right. But one descriptive word that doesn't get thrown around often in the genre of metal at the surface level of music understanding by the average non-metal listener is the word beautiful. And I think it's because for a lot of metal music and its countless subgenres, the aim of the game isn't necessarily to be beautiful. Although they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, a lot of metal music tends to lean into themes of anger, despair, doom, and gloom. Themes that, generally speaking, are quite far from the conventional definition of beautiful. As an avid metal enthusiast myself, most of the time I'm just here to listen to a piece of harsh, tough, explosive music to blow off steam or headbang in my chair for hours on end or relieve any stress that's been built up over the day. The definition of beautiful metal music may seem oxymoronic to the average music listener, but there is one metal album that I can genuinely describe as beautiful in the strangest yet most unexpected ways. An album that perfectly complements the harshness of metal music with the beauty of introspective emotion. An album that sounds like letting go of it all to find peace in the chaos. An album appropriately titled Sunbather. Sunbather is the second studio album released in 2013 by the American blackgaze band Deafheaven. Now, before we start talking about the album itself, let's take a minute to explain the genre of blackgaze, in case it's your first time hearing it. I wouldn't blame you if it is your first time hearing it, since it's a rather niche subgenre of metal music that is essentially the combination of two other subgenres of music, black metal and shoegaze. Black metal is a form of extreme metal music, originating in the mid-1980s from Norse countries like Norway and Sweden, notably with bands like Bathory and Merciful Fate, often using satanic imagery in their lyrics, the heavy use of corpse paint aesthetics, and a dark yet raw soundscape to evoke said blasphemous themes. This subgenre would eventually be fully realized in the 90s, with controversial bands like Mayhem and Burzum, using harsh shriek vocals, relentless blast beats, and an ever-existing dark, abrasive sound and production. If you're looking for some great classic black metal examples, just listen to albums like the self-titled Bathory album, or my personal favorite, Dark Thrones, Ablaze in the Northern Sky, if you're looking for some great classic black metal examples. Then we have shoegaze, a subgenre of alternative rock that focuses on heavy atmosphere and sheer volume, using techniques like distortion feedback and obscured vocals to create an ethereal soundscape that's akin to a soundtrack to a dream you can't quite remember. The most quintessential album in this genre would probably be My Bloody Valentine's 1991 record, Loveless, often being credited as the album that truly defined the shoegaze genre. Funnily enough, the name shoegaze actually stems from the musicians performing said genre, who would be constantly looking down at their mountain of effects pedals to create its sound, making it look like they're just gazing at their shoes. So now that we know what genre we're dealing with for today's album, you're probably thinking, well, how the hell could an album in this genre be considered beautiful? Well, for that, we need to look into a number of factors, starting with its sequencing. The album consists of 7 tracks, with a runtime of just under 60 minutes. Now, you might think a straight 1-hour session of black metal and shoegaze would be a little bit draining to brittle ears, so the band opted to sequence the album out into a simple A-B format, consisting of 4 brutal blackgaze tracks with all of its blast beats, screaming vocals, and atmospheric coding, and in between each track, sandwiching in 3 quiet, ambient, and highly atmospheric instrumental tracks consisting of drones, field recordings, and clean guitar riffs to accompany each previous track. These are not only used as interludes to give listeners a much needed cool down, but are also used to further enhance the atmosphere, theming, and flow of the entire album experience. As said in an interview by Deafheaven lead vocalist George Clark, quote, "Some of the things he was writing weren't fitting into anything in particular. They were their own little pieces. And so rather than trying to exhaust them in a longer song, we thought, we don't want to waste these riffs. Maybe we could use them as interludes." End quote. By listening to the album from start to finish, you not only get the full picture of the complete story being told, but you also get to experience every piece of emotion conveyed by the band, the way that an album should be constructed, if you ask me. The second aspect that makes Sunbather beautiful is in its musicality. Typically, a lot of black metal songs are, as the name might suggest, dark and brooding in their textures, timbre, and tone. This is, of course, to convey the darker themes of its lyrical content. You can't have a happy sounding song about Satan and expect all the Satanists to be down with it after all. Deafheaven cleverly uses the harshness of black metal vocals and combines it with the atmospheric sonic intensity of shoegaze to give their tracks a heavy yet weirdly enlightening sound. The clever use of dynamics also aids the emotional burst of each song, usually starting with a pummeling wall of noise, followed by a sudden, quieter section consisting of only a clean guitar, followed immediately then with another pummeling helping of blast beats and screams. It's like the feeling you get from breaking the surface of the water after diving down for a long period of time and getting that first breath of fresh air. It's freeing and comforting, yet in an explosive way. The energy of the more obvious black metal inspired walls of sound also help to further push the narrative of the entire album, which brings us to arguably the most important reason as to what makes Sunbather so beautiful: its lyrical content. Sunbather is ultimately a coming-of-age album, with its lyrics covering themes such as wealth disparity, insecurity, and inner emotional turmoil. Lead singer George Clark described it as an album that is, quote, "all about youth and identity in a way, not knowing yourself, and wanting more and looking at wealth disparity." But that's not overtly talked about. It's kind of just there as part of the theme of the album. I think about it as kind of apolitical and more focused on emotion and internal feelings and adjusting to the realities of adulthood, end quote. Something that I'm sure any young person from any background can relate to in one way or another. The first track on the album, Dreamhouse, captures this feeling of jealousy in another's wealth and the bitter feeling it creates, aided with the struggle of alcoholism to cope with these differences. Hindered by sober restlessness, submitting to the amber crutch. The theme, in my aching prose, fantasizing the sight of Manhattan. It's describing the depressing scene of a man drinking profusely and wallowing in his sorrow, looking at the bright lights of New York, the wealthy, perfect city that is far beyond his reach, both physically and mentally. The most prominent moment of this opening track, in my opinion, and the part that first sold me on the idea of this whole album, is in its final verse. After a quiet, clean guitar line, the instrumentals come back in an explosive, halftime, breakdown-like section, with the lead singer screaming the lines, "I'm dying. Is it blissful? It's like a dream. I want to dream with you." This actually stems from a drunk text conversation that lead singer George Clark had with a girl he was in love with, and said, quote, "It sounded nice at the time, so I wrote that text conversation down, and 2 years later, when I was working on that song, I thought it fit because it sums up the contrast between this big, beautiful ending and this big, tragic ending." End quote. It's almost as if we're witnessing someone slowly pass away with a smile on their face, as if they're content with the downward spiral of their life and are almost looking forward to the end of their days. The song then transitions into the first instrumental interlude track on the album, Irresistible, acting almost as a curtain call for the protagonist's final days. Beautiful and delicate guitar arpeggios accompanied by a lightly plucked guitar lick fade into silence, only for the silence to be abruptly broken by the third track, the titular title of the album, Sunbather. This track follows similar themes to Dreamhouse in a way, detailing George Clark's childhood memories of driving around affluent parts of California and witnessing the inequality of wealth and affluence firsthand, and feeling an ever-present anger towards something he longed for but couldn't have. I held my breath and drove through a maze of wealthy homes, and I watched how green the trees were, and I watched the steep walkways and the white fences. I gripped the wheel. I sweated against the leather. I watched the dogs twist through the wealthy garden. It's one thing when hearing these lyrics being read out in a flat way, as I'm doing in this video, and it's another when these words are screamed at the top of someone's voice, being buried deep under a crushing wall of guitars, drums, and drones. Although it's almost impossible to make out these lyrics the first, second, or even third time you listen to the track, the emotion that is being conveyed is very, very clear from the get-go. And I think that's what truly makes this album so captivating and awe-inspiring. This is further highlighted by the rather unique album cover, a pinkish orange hue with the name of the title in simple text that almost seems like it's melting away into the background. If you're at all aware of metal album covers, this cover is almost the antithesis of what a metal album should look like. But the design choice is completely intentional and meaningful. Simply put, the album cover is supposed to resemble the colors that someone sees behind their eyelids when their face is looking towards the sun, or, as the title suggests, while they're sunbathing. As explained by George Clark, quote, "That's the feeling it gives me. It's the sadness and the frustration and the anger that comes with striving for perfection, dreaming of warmth and love despite the pain of idealism." End quote. This crushing feeling of sadness and insecurity in the final moments of Sunbather then transitions smoothly into the second interlude track, Please Remember, a drone-filled ambient piece with spoken word sections by Stefan Nij Port of Alcest fame, often considered by many to be the founding father of the blackgaze genre. The words being read out is a section from The Unbearable Lightness of Being, a 1984 philosophical fictional novel by Milan Kundera, which George Clark cites as his favorite book. Quote, "That passage is really important to me. It just screams insecurity, which I have huge faults with." End quote. The song then spirals into a frenzy of whooping noise and harsh wavelengths before settling into a quieter guitar section, almost to signify the building and release of tension in the main character as he finds himself in a never-ending whirlpool of anxiety, sadness, and insecurity. The fifth track, Vertigo, launches back into the visceral blackgaze territory, this time reflecting on the main character's regret towards his past feelings of hatred and sadness for his insecurities, and, as the title of the track suggests, the longing feeling to fall from a height, perched up on a rope crafted in smoke, a sword wielding death that buried your hope, focusing on lights through the blinds. This idea of looking into a light is a common theme throughout the album, and could be interpreted in a number of ways, but I'd like to think of this light as the truth of one's identity. In the case with our main character, the idea that at the end of all of this retrospection that he's going through, he sees himself as this helpless, terrible, bitter, angry, and resentful person, running to substance abuse, falling into same habits, and shying away from the light of truth, lost in the patterns of youth where the windows shine brightly back at you. It's an incredibly heavy way to end an already heavy and long 14-minute blackgaze track, and this theme directly continues onto the final interlude track, appropriately titled Windows, where we hear two sets of audio samples over a beautiful drone soundscape. The first sample is that of Deafheaven guitarist Kerry McCoy conducting a drug deal, as McCoy was actually deep into his addiction during the creation process of the album. The second sample is that of a street preacher reciting Bible verses about the damnation of hell. These two seemingly thematically opposite samples coalesce into a unifying theme, as explained by George Clark. Quote, "Thematically, it's supposed to be about this guy talking about the evils of hell intermixed with one's own personal hell, and the actual realities like addiction and self-worth, not the fire and brimstone. He didn't have a lot of money, and he was kind of desperate. He's showcasing the true horrors that are here on Earth, one's own personal demons." End quote. We then transition into the final track, which is probably the heaviest and most gut-wrenching of them all, and is an incredible closer to an album that is already both thematically and sonically incredibly heavy and haunting. The peak entry is the culmination of all the anger and resentment felt towards the main character's insecurities, and focusing it all on one individual that they see as the cause of it all, their own biological father. In the track, George Clark blames his father for all of his substance abuse, alcoholism, and bitterness towards the wealthy, and in turn reflects upon his lack of a family dynamic growing up, and finally coming to understand that he is and will always be his father's son, for better or worse. Destroying the tomb of memories from your life, in the room full of family but couldn't find one. I am my father's son. I am no one. I cannot love. It's in my blood. There's something about the tone of this final verse repeating over and over and over again, on top of this almost serene instrumental that just feels absolutely gut-wrenching. And the way that the instrumental then slowly fades away, much like the light escaping out of a window as the sun slowly sets to signify the end of another day. What you're left with just feels so somber, like you're watching a movie of the life of a broken individual. After everything that you sat through, after all the ups and downs, the ending is an open-ended and deeply melancholic one. But amidst that melancholy, you feel that there could possibly be a tiny sliver of optimism still left, a small light at the end of the tunnel of introspection. It's not significant enough to make a change immediately, but it's enough to give you hope that maybe things will get better. And I think that's what makes Sunbather truly one of the most beautiful albums I've listened to, even though it is simultaneously one of the harshest, roughest, and most brutal sonic experiences a casual music listener could subject themselves to. Above all, it is a brilliantly sequenced, sonically unique, and emotionally heavy 60 minutes of music that, honestly speaking, I don't expect every casual music listener to immediately like, if at all. I'm fully aware that getting everyone to understand the complexities and ugly beauty of black metal shoegaze music is a tall order for any music nerd out there. But if you do get it, it's most likely going to be an unforgettable experience you'll want to keep coming back to. And honestly, isn't that what music is all about?